Hey everyone, happy Tuesday. We're back for another Tuesday Night Live. How are you going today, Seno?
I'm going well. G'day everyone. I've had a good day. It's a lovely warm day where I am anyway.
Day.
Spring has definitely sprung this week.
Well, yeah, it definitely has sprung. Okay, so we're in for a big night tonight, guys. We've got some fun things coming up shortly. But we're getting into another chapter of Ecclesiastes.
Yes,
Seno.
yeah.
It's going to be quite interesting, and you'll get to why it will be in your talk later on. But we're reaching kind of a different point of the book in a little bit. Hey.
Yeah, a bit of a change of tack, a bit of a swivel or a pivot in the book. So yeah, he's been kind of doing the same thing over and over. And tonight he actually changes his direction and does something a bit different.
Okay, well, we're looking forward to that. But we will be chatting a little bit about some fears tonight.
We will.
You know, some personal things might come out, you never know.
It's going to be a bit of therapy for everyone.
But to get us started for the night, Rachel is actually here in the studio with us. And she's going to be playing a little game with you guys watching along. So get your comments ready to interact with this game because she's going to be sharing some fun facts in a strange way and you kind of have to guess what's going on. But I'll let her explain it. So I'm going to pass over to Rachel now.
So hi all. As Caitlin said, I'm Rachel. I study nursing at Bathurst. And tonight I have got a game where I'll be getting you to guess some fears. So what I'll be doing is a couple of weeks ago, just like a series of unfortunate deaths, I'll ask a question. I'll ask what is such and such phobia, and I'll give you 4 options. And if you have your telephones around or your laptops, send in your comments, tell us what you think it is. And at the end, we can just have a bit of banter competition and see how many you got right. So I'll start us off with, what is phobophobia? Is it A, fear of missing out, so like FOMO? Is it B, fear of having a phobia? C, fear of taking phone calls? Or D, fear of Vietnamese soup? I'll give you all a bit of time to send through your comments.
Why would you be afraid of soup?
I'm not quite sure. I thought it might have been a fear of fob watchers, but that's not an option. So
Fob watchers.
Phobophobia. I thought, you know, but I don't. I think maybe you're afraid of drowning in your soup.
Vietnamese soup is called pho.
Oh, there you go. Fear of pho.
Fear of pho.
Fofi.
That's why it's Vietnamese soup.
So there we go, we've had a little bit of discussion from the couch, a little talk about Vietnamese soup, but the answer is actually B. Phobophobia is a fear of having a phobia.
How can you be afraid of that?
Easily.
Okie dokie, second question is, what is fear of being watched by a duck? Is it A, goosey-loosey phobia, B, ducklinophobia, C, quinophobia, or D, anatidaephobia?
Anatidaephobia.
I think Rachel pronounced it better than you, Seno.
I've had lots of practice.
I feel like we should just have a section of Rachel just pronouncing really hard words.
Right. I don't know if it'd be goosey-loosey or loosey-goosey. Which way around that goes. Isn't it loosey-goosey?
Well, if your name's Lucy, sure.
Yeah.
What if your name's Goosey?
Because that happens.
Okie dokie, a little bit of talk from the lounge again, but the answer is D, anatidaephobia. So just in case you have a fear of being watched by a duck, that's what your phobia is called.
I would say don't go to the duck pond in Bathurst.
Don't go to McKeddy Park if you're afraid of ducks.
Yeah.
But there could be a duck at your window right now.
Maybe. Okie dokie. Question number 3. What is Arakabutira phobia? Is it A, fear of peanut butter being stuck to the roof of your mouth?
That's terrifying.
Is it B, fear of swallowing Vegemite? Is it C, fear of eating a spider in your sleep? Or is it D, fear of choking on a spoonful of Nutella?
I think I'd be afraid of eating a spider at any time. I'm not sure I'd have a special and unique fear.
You know, people do that naturally though. They just put a spider in their mouth.
I had a cockroach bite me in my sleep. One of those big, ugly mongrel cockroaches when we lived in Sydney.
In your bed?
Well, our house was infested with them. It was just running around doing its thing.
Oh,
Bit me.
gross.
Yeah. good anyway.
Well, there you go. Fun facts about Sano and cockroaches. But the answer for what is Arachabutyrophobia is A, fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth.
What? Anyway,
It just gets there and it's annoying, and you never know. It
I
might
feel
stop
like
you
we're going to
breathing.
talk. We're going to talk about our fears, and they will also be irrational. But yeah,
Okie dokie. Question number 4.
do fear of them.
What is the fear of the great mole rat? Is it A, cathysophobia?
You got it?
Thank you. Is it B, wraithophobia? Is it C, xenophobia? Or is it D, moliolopephobia? Send in 3 your questions, what
You're
you
just
think.
making them up now.
So you should know this. You're wise. You know
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's it's definitely I don't know moliolopephobia.
Let's see. If you're right.
Moliolopephobia, and it is not, so you are wrong.
Oh!
The answer is C, xenophobia
Of course it-
is
well,
the
of
fear
course it
of the
is.
great mole rat.
Yeah, of course, that's what it is.
Okay, last question, and a big word for me to say, but what is hippopotamonstrosequipedaliophobia?
That's my clap.
Is
Right there.
Is it A, fear of monster hippos? Is it B, fear of African animals? Is it C, fear of spelling? Or is it D, fear of long words?
I feel like that would be horrible if it was fear of long words and that's what they called it.
Um,
That's mean, right?
yeah, I think it is fear of long words. That'd be my
Because
guess.
then you have to say, oh, what phobia do you have? And then they're going to be terrified to tell you what
Yeah.
phobia they
Yes,
have.
that's right. Yeah.
That's mean.
Well, Senna, you are right. Hippopotamonstrosequipedaliophobia is fear of long words. So there we go, that's the game. We only have 5 rounds, but send through your comments how many of those you got right. And I hope you had fun, and I'll send it back to the lounge.
Well, there you go. Thanks so much, Rach. Let us know how you went. Mark up your scores. You win bragging rights or something. Maybe you can tell us your fears or, I don't know, something
my,
for a prize.
my fear's doing poor at multiple choice games.
I'm
you
sure
know.
that's a fear out there. But no, who knows? There's a lot of fears, I think, which is really interesting. I've
There
never
are.
heard of half of those fears.
No. I struggle to, like, I'm afraid of lots of things, but I feel like my fears are rational. So when I was a teenager, I had it was a summer I wasn't wearing a shirt. I had a huntsman spider about this big jump onto my bare back and run across my back and then drop onto the floor. And I screamed like a baby. I was I'm not ashamed to say I freaked right out. But that I feel is a rational fear, like a fear of
And so
spiders.
how big was the spider again?
It was as big as a dinner plate. It was
Can you
massive.
just show people what the size? I just don't believe that. That's
You've never seen a huntsman that big.
no. Never.
They grow big, okay? They grow massive, especially up in Gosford where I come from.
Right. Okay.
They grow big up there. The
Okay.
rats, the bush rats, the body of the rat was this big. When the tail came off the end of it. They used to crawl through the roof of the house and stick the nose through the holes
Yeah.
and say hello to us.
Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah.
Were you afraid of them as much as this one?
No, they were fine.
Oh, just
They
the
were,
spider
it was
you were
just,
afraid of.
well, I mean, yeah, anyway. I feel like a spider anyway is a rational fear,
Rational
right?
fear, yeah,
There are
that's
rational
true.
fears we have,
Lots
but
of
then
people.
sometimes there are, like these things, the phobias there.
They're
we
very
would call them,
irrational.
like, I mean, fear of peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth. I mean, that's an irrational fear, isn't it? I mean, you've had peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth.
Oh, well, I mean, everyone who's eaten peanut butter has.
Did you start freaking out?
No,
No,
it's part of
yeah.
the joy of eating peanut butter.
That's right,
Like,
yeah,
you-
yeah.
That's how you know that you've got enough peanut butter on your sandwich. Cause
Yeah.
it's getting stuck.
Yeah. It's all part of the good.
Yeah.
And so it's irrational to be
Yes.
afraid of those things.
But see,
Um,
obviously something has had to have happened, I think, for them to be afraid of it.
Yeah, I guess maybe sometimes it's a trigger, but sometimes it's something else. I don't know what it is. Yeah, I don't know.
We have to meet those people and ask them.
I feel like I'm helping to expose a fear tonight. I want to do something for you out there in in Zoom land, and just. Sorry, Caitlin.
Wow. Yeah.
You have a slight fear. I'll hide them away. They're gone. They're gone now.
We had a rule an unspoken rule that if you were going to have your shoes off, you wouldn't do this.
I wouldn't do
so-
that. Sorry, I apologise.
No, it's
That was
okay.
bad. We need to recover now.
Well, if people don't know this about me already, they're now gonna find out.
You have a small, just a small.
just a small, slight fear of feet.
Yeah,
Anyone's feet, my own feet, Sano's feet, everyone's feet.
feet. What is? Anyway, I want to ask because it's the thing, isn't it? Like you don't know why. Do you know why?
No, not really.
Yeah.
No, it's just they're there all the time, and now all of a sudden I don't like it.
I like it. Yes, and you saw the reaction. I'm gonna pay for that.
It's not as bad as one time someone trapped me
Ooh.
by holding their feet around my feet. And like I couldn't move, and I was in tears,
Freaking
like
out.
hyperventilating,
Okay.
and like stop. And they then realised
Right.
that my fear is real. It is
Yeah.
a real fear, and it I will have nightmares about that now.
You will not go back and watch this show.
No.
Yeah, this show.
Never.
You'll go try and expunge your copies off the interweb and.
Yeah. Also, you watch everyone now who is my friend on Tuesday Night Live will start tagging me in feet things because that's how.
No,
many are out. Yes.
no, they won't. You won't
have
do
just
that.
unleashed.
You wouldn't do that, would you? You would no, no.
Let's
No.
hope not.
Of course not.
Otherwise, I'll be sending them your
And
way.
so,
Some Huntsman spiders.
perhaps what you do is you get me to curate your Facebook for you. I'll watch it for you and then just let you know. if there are any-
You'll make sure no feet come
Yeah.
through on the
Yeah,
picture.
I do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So. But these fears, they're very interesting. Like,
Yeah.
you know, okay, I've got an irrational fear. I
Yeah.
admit that it's irrational, but yeah, you know,
It's what
it
is.
affects me
Yeah.
day to day. But we were talking about, you know, there's other fears that are a bit more limiting than mine. At least, you know, there's nothing I can do about the fact that people have feet and I
No,
have feet.
but
except for
mostly
wear
they
socks.
encase them in things,
Yes.
or they keep them out of your face.
Yes. Which is, you know, preferred.
Preferred, yes. Yeah.
But we were speaking about a fear earlier today about, you know, the fear of leaving your house.
Yeah,
And how it entraps you and it, you know,
Debilitating.
yeah, it's really hard. And all of a sudden, it's not humorous anymore. Like,
No.
people can laugh at me and that's fine. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I laugh at myself. But a fear that kind of stops you from actually being able to live your
Yeah.
life daily.
Fear
like,
of crowds, a fear of being in
Yeah.
open spaces, a fear of going, all those sort of things. They can wreck your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
And so it leaves this big question of what do you do? And also, like, how, why, what does this say about us? The fact that people can have these fears, whether they're irrational, whether they're rational, what does it actually say about us?
Yeah, I guess fear is a natural thing, isn't it? Because you learn fear from being little, and rational fears. You know, being afraid is part of being human, isn't it? We're rightly afraid of all sorts of things. You know, you develop a fear of sticking your hand in holes or touching hot things, that sort of thing. And that's a rational fear because you can be hurt. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah,
There's a knowledge behind that fear.
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, okay, this is nothing and I'm just afraid of nothing.
yeah.
It's actually, there's a fear for a good reason
Yeah.
sometimes.
There are things that's right to be scared of.
Yeah.
Or afraid of. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how, I guess, in a sense, do we deal with fear then? Because do we keep on living with fear? Like, can we ever not have fear, I guess, in our life?
I think we probably can't, can we? I mean, you can't.
No, I can't.
But absent that, I think we probably can't because you have to be afraid of touching a hot plate.
Yeah.
You have to be afraid of stepping out in front of the traffic without looking. Otherwise, you will cease living pretty quickly. So I don't think we can live without certain the warranted fears. They're an important part of life.
Yeah.
And you probably have a catalogue of all the things you're rightly afraid of. So yeah, I guess I think that we tend to try and control our fears, don't we?
Yeah.
And there are two kind of basic answers to fear. One is controlling the future. So if I control the future, if I control what happens, if I'm in control, then my fears can't come about because I'm in charge. And so I control my fears by not touching hot plates, by watching where I go. I'm in control. I take control of my life. And I think the other thing we try and do is to know the future. The way of controlling our fears is to know the future. Because if our fears about what might happen to me, then if I can know the future, then I don't need to be afraid because I know what's going to happen, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we tend to, I think, probably go for those two things: control controlling life and knowing the future
Yeah.
would probably be the two things we try and
Yeah.
use to conquer fear.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it, I guess, especially knowing the future.
Yeah.
Because you think if you knew what was about to happen, then it would take away your fear because you're like, oh, okay, well, I don't need to fear jumping off this high dive right now because I know I'm going to be okay. But when you don't know the future, you stand up there in the height and you're just like, well, I don't know. What if I'm not going to be okay? And that's what drives the fear of the unknown.
Yeah. And it's like, you're sitting at a table, you're sitting in a chair, and someone's walking up behind you. Well, if you know they're walking up behind you, you're not going to be, you're not going to jump. But if you don't know,
someone is,
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's the way we try and do it. I think the problem is there are some things we can control, there are some things we can know, but the big things we can't know. You die by accident.
Yeah.
Well, is it rational then to never leave your house? Because any time you leave your house, you could die. But dealing with those sort of things is hard. Because you can't know your future. You can't know everything.
Yeah. And we're going to get into a fear tonight, actually, from the passage that we're looking at. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5 is where we're at. And there's this phrase brought up about the fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
It's an interesting phrase, and you're going to get into it a lot more tonight. But it just raises that question a lot about, well, what does it mean to fear?
Yeah.
And what knowledge is there behind that fear?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
We don't normally associate fear with God.
Yeah.
In many ways.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to hear a lot more about that.
Yep.
But to hear this new perspective that we're going to read about in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. So we're going to now pass over to Mac, who's going to be reading the Bible for us. So the passage is Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we're going from verses 1 to 7. So thank you very much, Mac.
who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven and you are on earth. So let your words be few. As a dream comes where there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin. And do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow is a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, stand in awe of God.
G'day. It's been a bit of a testing night in the studio tonight, but we're going to kick off. Ecclesiastes is a truly unique and exceptional book. It was written 3,000 years ago by a Middle Eastern king. 3,000 years ago. Yet its words ring down the ages. The insights the teacher has about the meaning of life under the sun show that he gets what it means to be us, to be human beings, struggling to grasp some kind of meaning in a life that seems random and hopeless. And we've gone on a journey with the teacher as he's tested just about every aspect of life under the sun, life in a world where we can't seem to see beyond the horizon. And it turns out that life hasn't changed all that much in 3,000 years, despite all the new tech. Despite the fact that we live a little bit longer and a little bit more comfortably, despite all our advances in knowledge and skill, we're still subject to all the same forces. We live longer, sure, yet we still die. And death is random and unpredictable. And we feel the same emptiness that the teacher felt when we really look at what we do in light of our death. We feel the same frustration, the same anger at injustice, the same hollow grief at loss, the same hunger for meaning in a world that doesn't seem able to provide it. We long to look beyond the horizon, to go beyond the sun, to reach for meaning, for purpose, for hope. So that's what the teacher provides us here in chapter 5. For the first time, he takes us beyond the sun. Now, over the past few weeks, I've been asking you the question about your answer. How do you get beyond the sun to answer the question of meaning and purpose and hope? Well, here is the teacher's answer. His answer is God. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, of course that's what he'd say. Invent fairies at the bottom of the garden because you can't face the harsh realities of living in this world. But I want to suggest to you that belief in a creator is completely reasonable. It's not unreasonable to believe that there is a God who really exists, who infuses this world and my life with meaning and purpose and hope. Now, you can, of course, come back with a question in the comments, and I'm happy to have that conversation about why believing in God is reasonable. But I want us to move forward here tonight because the teacher's answer isn't just that there is some God that exists somewhere out there. No, he believes in a God who not only made all of this, but is interested in it, is invested in it, is invested in me and you. And because the Creator is invested in you, the way you relate to your Creator is important. If you believe that there is something beyond the sun, more importantly, someone beyond the sun, then who that is and how you relate with them will become very important. And the teacher wants to give us some advice, some wisdom on how to relate to God. He has 3 pieces of advice here tonight, and you could sum them up really simply by saying, be quick to listen, be slow to speak, and remember that God hears every word you say. Be quick to listen, be slow to speak, and remember that God hears every single word you speak. Now, the first 2 pieces of wisdom go together, and the teacher makes a contrast between wisdom and folly, the wise person and the fool. He says, be careful, guard your steps when you come before God. The fool, he says, comes to God full of themselves and parading their religion. The fool thinks that what God is looking for is performance, and so the fool performs. He offers sacrifices. He offers grand, self-important prayers full of his own self-righteousness. He tells God exactly how worthy he is, and then he gives God advice on how best to move forward. The fool always seems to know exactly what God's thinking, because it's exactly what he's thinking. And he's not afraid to tell everyone about it and to remind God when he needs reminding. Verse 3 says, a dream comes when there are many cares, and many words mark the speech of a fool. And I think what this means is that just like dreams are fleeting and mostly nonsense, so are the words of the fool. And I think we all know people like this. We all know people whose first instinct is to fill the void with words. Lots of words, empty words, nothing words. And the teacher says, don't be like this with God. It's foolish. It's foolish for 2 reasons. First, he says in verse 2, God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. God is the one who exists beyond the sun, who's always existed, who made all of this. Do you think he needs your advice? Do you think he's unaware of your point of view? Do you think he hasn't taken it into consideration? God's wisdom is the wisdom that created the entire universe and keeps it in motion. God's wisdom made all of this, all of us. He doesn't need your words. No, you need his words. We all desperately need the Creator's perspective to understand life in his creation. So stop speaking and start listening. The second reason we find in verse 1, where he says, go near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools who do not know that they do wrong. So the fool is a religious person who doesn't understand his own religion. He offers sacrifices because, well, that's what religious people do. But he doesn't understand that the sacrifices exist because he is in the wrong with God. It's like people today who say, religion's nice, it's good for us, it teaches our kids to be good people. But we've forgotten the reason religion exists is because of the evil we do in the world. The reason sacrifices are necessary is because we do wrong. And we need to stop speaking and start listening to God to get this. To understand that we are part of the problem, not part of the solution. So we listen because we need God more than he needs us. Now I'm going to come back to this briefly at the end because Jesus tells a great story that highlights what the teacher's saying. But I want to move on to the final piece of advice. Remember that God hears every word you say. God cares about the truth, and he cares about truthfulness. He cares that our words match our actions, and particularly he cares that the things we commit ourselves to, our vows or oaths, are kept. So take a look at verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to make a vow than to make one and not fulfill it. Don't let your mouth lead you into sin. So to speak and not act is evil. Jesus tells a story about two sons who are given a command by their father. The first one says, well, I'll do it, but then he doesn't. The second son says he won't do it, but then he later obeys. Which one is worse? Well, the first one, says Jesus, who didn't keep his promise. And we know this in our own lives. We avoid the people who are all talk and no action. People who make promises to us and don't follow through. They're worthless to us because we can't trust them. And God hears every word we say, every false word, every lie, every failed promise, and he will hold us accountable. Yet another reason to be slow to speak and quick to listen. The teacher says the answer is to stand in awe of God, or more literally, to fear God. To understand that God is the one who is beyond the sun. He's the creator. He holds your life in his hands. Now, there are loads of things we're afraid of, mostly for good reason, because fear keeps us from trouble. And this is exactly why we should fear God, he says. Because God is the one who holds our lives in his hands. He holds our past, our present, and our future in his hands. And that's something to pay attention to. Because God is the one who knows us truly. And he's the one who can deal with our wrong without destroying us. I want to wrap this up with that story I was mentioning that Jesus told. Because the stories Jesus tells are filled with the wisdom the teacher is giving us here. And they make it more concrete. Jesus tells a story of two men who, like the person in Ecclesiastes 5, go into the temple to come before God. The first man is the fool, the religious person. He is just full of himself, his goodness and his religion. He parades himself to the central spot in the temple. He stands tall and proud. He looks up as if to gaze right into the eyes of God himself. And he says to God, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and get a tenth of all I get. Can you see the fool the teacher's talking about? And yet I think this is actually many of us. We want to justify ourselves. We want to think we're okay, that we don't need God. The second man in the story, though, is the true wise man. He is away in a corner alone. He can't bring himself even to raise his head from looking at the floor. He beats his chest in shame. His words are few and to the point. He says this, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the big question of the story is, which one of these has God's stamp of approval? Which one has what God is looking for? And most of us would probably be thinking, surely the religious person. He's a good person. He's a religious person. Surely it's him. But Jesus says the other man, the humble one who simply begged for mercy, is the one who went away justified with God's stamp of approval. Why? Because he humbled himself. Because he understood that God doesn't need us. We need him. Because he knew that he does wrong and that he needs God's help. A help which Jesus himself had come to give. As Jesus gave himself up to die as a sacrifice. Now here in chapter 5 of Ecclesiastes is the first time that the teacher has taken us beyond the sun, behind the curtain if you like. And next week we're going to go right back to his observations of life in this world. But for now it's worth considering, what is wisdom for you beyond the sun? To believe that there is a God beyond the horizon who made all of this is not an unreasonable belief. And if you're wise, you'll approach this God with caution, humbly, not thinking that you have all the answers, not thinking that God needs your opinions, but willing to listen to him, to hear what he has to say to you about you and your life.
Hey everyone, I'm or whatever it is that helps you concentrate. Dear Father, we know that the world we live in is truly broken and filled with wickedness. We pray tonight for those who have become caught up in the world of human trafficking and sex slavery. Please bring your comfort and safety to their captives and show them the freedom that is found in you. You are with those who are suffering, just as your Son suffered on the cross when he died to take away the sins of the world. Thank you for organisations like A21 and Destiny Rescue, who are working with police to bring freedoms to the captives in this life. Please guide them and be with them as they do this work, and keep them safe as they work to bring others to safety. We thank you that you are a just God and deal with our wickedness in your timing. We long for the day that your justice is shown to the earth. Amen.
Okay, thank you very much, Kel, for leading us in prayer, and thank you for helping us look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and look at the fear of God. But also, again, it was really interesting to see that theme of wise and foolish kind of still come in throughout it. It's obviously been a big theme throughout the whole book so far, and to see that there is still two different approaches in how you go to God. Yeah.
It's quite jarring, I think, in the book to step behind the curtain like that, to kind of step outside of this frame and go beyond the sun like that. And it's really interesting what he chooses to say when he does that.
Yeah.
You know, to talk about the fear of God and being cautious about your words, which is, I think, a really interesting perspective just to put right here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it is now time for question time. We've got a couple of questions so far, but I can see that a lot more questions are popping up now, so we'll see what we can get through. But we'll start with Andrew's one. So Andrew's got a question regarding Proverbs 30 and 31. They have sayings of Agur, son of Jakeh, and of King Lemuel. I'm not sure how to say it, sorry. Do we know who these people are historically? He doesn't remember reading about either of them anywhere from the Old Testament. Any thoughts on that?
I have no thoughts. I would have to actually look, so I'm speaking without real knowledge here. I'll do a bit of research later and just check. But to my knowledge, they're not from Israel. What's quite possible is that in drawing together wisdom, what Solomon's doing is drawing in wisdom from all around him. And so these are quite possibly the sayings that have been collected from other places that he's kind of adding into his collection of wisdom.
Okay.
So I don't really know. I'm just speculating. But I'll do a bit of research and see if that's and update things if I'm wrong.
Sounds good. Okay, well, we'll jump to the next question, which is about how does verse 2, so I assume of this chapter that we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, which is let your words be few, fit with Philippians 4, 6-7. So I'll read that out for people once I flip there, so that everyone knows what these verses are. So 4, 6-7 in Philippians says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ. Could you help us out with that?
Yeah. So obviously it seems that it's a great question, Monique. It seems that in the New Testament, particularly, Christians are urged to bring their requests to God. You know, if you're worried about anything, ask God. If you lack wisdom, ask for God's help. If you're afraid, come to God for help. I think that actually fits quite well, because those things are all coming to God humbly and asking Him for help. I think the words here that it's speaking about in Ecclesiastes are words about yourself and words from and of yourself, words that justify yourself, words like the man in Jesus' story, who's just full of himself. And so I think God wants us to come to Him as His children and ask Him for help. And so that's how I'd see that it fits in. That's exactly the kind of thing. But what Jesus would say is, it's not blabbing to God that causes God to act. You can't manipulate God into action by using lots of words. You come to God as His child and ask Him for help.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. We've got a question that I think might kind of relate to that. I'm just going to squeeze forward because I can't see the things. But it's from Tash.
Yep.
And she's asking about how can we find a good balance between humbling ourselves in prayer and revering God, but then also presenting Him with our requests as children. So again, bringing up Philippians and that idea. So how do we have that balance? Because I guess humbling and revering Him, having that fear, but also, and we saw it in Hebrews when we went through Hebrews earlier this year, that we are to actually come with confidence and be bold, and we see that through the Psalms. There is a lot of confidence and boldness in the way that people approach God. Yeah.
Well, yes, I think that's exactly right. And I think what I'd say is that humility and boldness go together here. It's not, humility doesn't mean that we're hesitant. Being humble doesn't mean that you're hesitant to come to God. It means that you don't exalt yourself in front of God. You don't big note yourself, and so I think it fits perfectly. Because a child doesn't lord it over their parents. A child comes to their parents and asks them for things. You know, every day when my dad got home from work, we'd ask him to come play cricket with us in the yard, and he would answer that prayer and go and play cricket with us in the yard. I don't think it's wrong to come to God as His children and ask Him for things. I think that boldness that we have, that because of Jesus we can actually bring ourselves to God and ask Him for things is completely fine. Humility doesn't mean that we need to be hesitant to speak to God. It means we need to understand who God is and who we are, and that we come to God not as God's equals, and not as God's bosses, but as His children, and with Him as the King.
Right, so finding that humility is actually about understanding who God is and who we are, and putting that together.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think that these things will make us more, in a sense, more bold, because I think if you have to prove yourself, that can make you afraid, you know, because, well, am I in the right position to come to God? Whereas we don't have to worry about that, because God has got us in a sense. He loves us and cares for us. He's the one who saved us and rescued us. And that gives us, in humility, great boldness to come before Him. So these are really good questions. And it's funny, isn't it, that we often think, oh, humility means I shouldn't even ask. But that's not what it's talking about at all. Humility means coming to God as someone who begs Him for mercy, and He loves those prayers.
Is there times that you think, and especially looking at that example of the story that Jesus told about, it was the Pharisee and the tax collector, wasn't it? So the Pharisee was the one who came like a fool, very full of himself, and the tax collector, you know, very, very humble. Can we ever have, in a sense, false humility? Like, can we not be genuine in the way that we actually approach God?
Yeah, I think the Bible even mentions false humility. 2 Timothy chapter 3, I think it talks about people's false humility. Yeah, I think we can put on a show, and true humility is recognising our failings and faults. It's funny, isn't it? I think, when's the time you're least likely to pray to God?
Probably when you're most confident, when you don't feel like you need it.
Perhaps, or when you sin, and you don't feel like you're worthy. Shame. You don't feel like you're worthy to come to God because you feel like you've done something wrong or you haven't measured up to the mark. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? That just reinforces the foolishness of the Pharisee. It's the fool who thinks you can only come to God in your pride. That you can only come to God in your arrogance. That's foolish thinking. We come to God in our humility, knowing that we're all beggars together at the foot of the cross. We all need God's help. We all need His forgiveness and His mercy. And so I think that's the marvellous and incredible and mind-boggling flip in the Bible, that it is not the proud people who have God's ear. It is the humble people who know they're sinners. And so it's when we sin that we most need to come to God.
Yeah, very interesting. So I hope that's helpful for both Monique and Tash with that question there. We've got a question as well, kind of talking about that person. So Michael's brought up the story again. And if the religious man in that parable, if he wasn't considered good by his religious actions, how should we view religious practices and things like going to church and fasting, doing those sort of things?
Well, Michael, I think it depends what you mean by considered. I think people did consider him very good. He was an exceptionally good person, and everybody knew it. And so the issue wasn't whether he was considered a good person. He was a good person. The question is whether his goodness is enough, and whether that's what makes him acceptable to God. And he's not good enough in that sense to bring himself to God. I've lost the question now, but
it's about those practices.
But in terms of how we should view religious things, Bible's interesting on the word religion. It says true and undefiled religion in James chapter 1 says is to care for widows and orphans in their distress and to keep oneself from being spotted by the world. And so true religion is about loving others and loving God. what we consider religious actions like going to church are actually an expression of our trust in Jesus. And so we, in a sense, we don't go to church because it's some religious activity that we perform. We go to church because it's an expression of our trust in Jesus. We go to church to hear from him, to submit ourselves to him. And so church is not the same as these religious actions like going to the temple. It's a different kind of thing. Fasting in some sense is a symbolic kind of religious action. And I think if you want to fast, go for it. Jesus says, Jesus' advice is do your works of righteousness in private. So if you're going to fast, don't brag on it.
And do you think there's a need to understand why you're doing the things that you're doing?
Yeah.
Because often some of the issues with this religious stuff is there's not an understanding as to why there is fasting, why there is praying, why there is Bible.
Yeah, that's true. And Jesus critiques exactly that in the Gospels. He talks about those people who parade their acts of righteousness, their religious actions in front of people in order to be noticed. And what he basically says is they've already received their reward. What they were looking for is the applause of people. They got it, and that's all they're going to get. Jesus says they're not going to get anything from God. And this is the problem with us in religion. We think it's all about justifying ourselves, and if I get this, I've got brownie points. And so if we feel like when we're most on top of things and in control of things ourselves, and we're forging ahead, that's when God most accepts us. But we're wrong about that. God accepts us because of Jesus. That's when we're accepted by God. And it's in our moments of humility and brokenness is when we realise that. And so often that's what God does to us. He breaks us down to teach us that lesson. It's not an easy one to learn, though.
Now we've got a couple of questions, Seno, about the mugs here in the middle.
Yes.
Who are they? People really need to know.
Honestly, I don't know who they are. But this is a kind of a thing. You see these around. I was up in the Blue Mountains last week. We went to an antique shop, and there's a whole bunch of these that you can buy. They were just one of those things that it's very English, and they would make, I think this is, I'm not sure this is actually a mug. I think this is actually a milk jug.
It's very strange.
This fellow, but I honestly do not know what was going on, but I thought they were too, Janelle had a couple of them in the cupboard, and I thought they were just too good to pass up.
Well, there you go, guys. I don't think it's who you think it is.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a good question here from Tristan. So we might end on this one. But as not fulfilling a vow is letting our mouths lead us to sin. Is it better for someone who is not ready to live... Oh, the question's gone. Someone who is not ready to live like a Christian but believes to call themselves a Christian? I don't know if you can say that.
Look, that's a really interesting and good question, Tristan. I think that the key thing, I think what you're saying there is that, in a sense, living and believing go together, and I think that's true. And so I think the point I'd make about it is, if you truly believe that Jesus is King, that is, that's what faith means, to believe that thing, that will actually change the way you live. And so you can't avoid stitching those two things up together. And so I don't think you can be ready to believe in Jesus and not understand that means a change in your life. So I can tell you, I grew up in a religious household. I knew all about the gospel, and I thought it was true. I didn't think it was untrue, but I did not live as if it was true. And so I don't call myself a Christian. Did I believe all those things were true? Absolutely I did, but they didn't affect my life, and so I wouldn't call myself a Christian. And really for me that change came when I realised that Jesus was actually properly really Lord. He was risen from the dead, he was King of all things, and that must mean a change in my life. And so the two things I think go together. I'm not sure if I've got to the heart of your question there though, so feel free to...
Could I ask you some questions,
sure.
perhaps? So after you made that decision, because I think it's helpful for people to kind of have a practical example and a personal experience. So once you made that decision, obviously before that point you had not been living as a Christian because you believed that you weren't, because you weren't living it out. And when that truth really hit you, what what was it that changed in your life, and how easy was it to actually change from that to now say, oh, okay, well, I'm a Christian, I've got to change the way that I live?
Yeah, I think some things were easy, some things were hard. So I think immediately some things just changed. So, my mouth changed.
Yeah.
The way I spoke radically changed. Not just swearing, but the way I spoke to people changed. And that changed dramatically and straight away. I think I had a hunger for the Bible. I couldn't stop reading the Bible. Other things, though, took more time. I just wasn't aware of the way I behaved and what it was like. And that took time to change. And I think as well, I feel like now, I'm now 32 years later,
Wow.
I think. And 32 years later, I can say as well, I ebb and flow. And so some things something that changed drastically back then, I've struggled with later on. And so, you're not a Christian when you're perfect.
Yeah.
You are a Christian when you put your trust in Jesus. But that trust in Jesus must and will begin to change the way you live. And so there's a tension there, I think, Tristan, between what I don't want to say is you have to be a certain kind of person and fulfill certain religious criteria to be a proper Christian. And that's what we often do. And so I'm not ready to live as a Christian means I don't like church the same way you do, or I'm not up to this, or still like a drink, or whatever it is. And so I mustn't be ready to be a Christian because I'm not quite good. I haven't sorted my life out yet enough. And I don't think that is true. I think you become a Christian and then you allow God to go to work on your life.
Yeah.
And the reality is that some things will change quickly, and other things, they'll take a bit of work. And God will chip away at you over your life. So it's not I don't think you can look at your life and go, I can't become a Christian yet. I think in many ways that's a silly thing to do. You ask yourself the question, do you believe that Jesus is risen from the dead? If you believe that's true, then today's the day to be a Christian. Now you may struggle with that, you may wrestle with it, you may fight it in some ways, you may find it hard, but if you realise that that's true about Jesus, then today's the day to commit yourself to that. And God makes promises about his commitment to you and how he'll be at work with you.
Yeah, and I think that's why just looking through Ecclesiastes 5 was so helpful tonight to think about, just those two different people. The way the wise person comes to God and the way the foolish person comes to God. And actually that story that Jesus told shows us what it looks like to come before God. And to actually see yourself for who you are and know that you're not perfect. And know that at the end of the day, though, if we believe in Jesus, that he came to die for our sins, to then be resurrected and show us that it is complete, that is something so amazing to say, oh, okay, well, God loved me when I was a sinner. When I was his enemy, that's when he sent his son to die. And so at some point it's like, well, you will never be ready to be a Christian because you're God's enemy.
And so in that sense, there's no such thing as ready to become a Christian. The person who knows that they're a sinner. That's how the wise man comes to God. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that's the moment. And so the moment you're ready to become a Christian is the moment you're willing to admit that you're in the wrong. You're willing to admit that God's right about you, and you're willing to admit that Jesus is the risen King, who's actually taken your place and died for you. When you're willing to admit those things, then you're ready. You're ready to be a Christian.
I feel like we could talk all night about this. It is such a real moment for a lot of people who are watching tonight, but it's also a big question for a lot of people perhaps watching tonight. And you raised a good question, that kind of, how will you approach God? If you believe in God, how are you going to come to him? You've got two different ways. And so it's very interesting. And if you don't believe in God, well, Sano left the space open for you to ask those questions. So if you have any questions about whether or not, and how did you put it, the reasonable way that God is real.
And so I do think it's reasonable. I don't want to go into the idea of philosophical proofs and that sort of thing. I'm happy to talk about those sort of ideas. But belief in God is a reasonable, rational thing to do. It's not irrational. It's not some kind of leap in the dark to believe that there's a God. belief in God is absolutely reasonable given the world that we live in.
Yeah.
So, and I'm happy to have that discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, so please, if you have any questions about that, please put it in the comments. We've got a bunch more questions that have come through that we will get to on Thursday.
Yep.
So don't forget about Thursday question time, where we'll have that chance to really dive into these questions a little bit more. One last thing, Sano, before we go tonight, it's a message from your wife. You better take care of these mugs. Just saying. We'll try and give proof that he doesn't break them. And if he does, it's all his fault.
Am I in trouble?
Thank you for coming along and watching Tuesday Night Live for another week. We'll see you next week when we get into, again, looking at life under the sun.
See you then.
Bye.